The desert wind howled through the high-risk training compound as elite recruits snickered at the ragged woman shivering in the corner. They thought she was a washed-up contractor, a nobody. They had no idea they were mocking the deadliest Tier 1 sniper in naval special warfare history. The sun over the Nevada desert was merciless, baking the cracked earth of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, Advanced Marksman Facility at Fort Fallon. It was 112 degrees in the shade, and out on the firing line, the heat shimmer made targets at 1,000 yards look like dancing mirages. A fresh crop of Tier 1 hopefuls, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and fresh Navy SWCCs were sprawled on their shooting mats, dripping sweat, adjusting the optics on their Mark 22 advanced sniper rifles. They were the best of the best, or at least they believed they were. Confidence is a requirement in special operations. Arrogance, however, is a liability, and Private First Class Bradley Hayes had plenty of the latter. Hayes, a broad-shouldered ranger with a jawline cut from granite and a perfect service record, pulled away from his scope and wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead. He looked down the firing line and nudged Corporal Derek Rollins, a recon Marine, beside him. "Hey, Rollins," Hayes whispered, gesturing with his chin. "Get a load of the brass's new pet." Standing 20 yards away, speaking quietly with Base Commander Captain Thomas Mitchell, was a woman who looked entirely out of place. She was lean, her hair pulled back into a messy, dust-covered bun. But what drew the recruit's stares was her attire. In the blistering Nevada heat, she was wearing a faded olive-drab M65 field jacket. The jacket was a wreck. The left sleeve was held together by strips of black duct tape. The collar was frayed into loose threads, and dark, rusted stains mottled the chest. She kept her hands shoved deep into the pockets, her shoulders hunched, as if she were standing in a blizzard rather than a desert furnace. "What is that?" Rollins snorted, adjusting his ear protection. "A homeless person wander onto the range? Look at that jacket. It looks like it got chewed up by a wood chipper." "I heard Mitchell brought in some civilian contractor to evaluate our wind-calling techniques." Hayes laughed quietly. "Probably some desk jockey from Quantico who read a book on ballistics once. Look at her shivering. It's 112 degrees and she's freezing. Lady needs a hospital, not a rifle." The laughter rippled down the line of recruits. They were young, full of adrenaline, and possessed the dangerous illusion of invincibility. Captain Mitchell, a seasoned combat veteran who tolerated zero nonsense, caught the sound of the snickering. His eyes narrowed, and he began to march toward the recruits, his face flushing red. But before he could take 3 steps, the woman in the torn jacket reached out and placed a surprisingly steady, calloused hand on his forearm. "Let it go, Tom," she said. Her voice was quiet, raspy, like dry leaves scraping across asphalt. "They're young. They don't know." "They're being disrespectful, Cassidy," Mitchell replied, his jaw tight. "They have no idea who they're talking to." "Good," Cassidy Miller replied, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of her cracked lips. "Let's keep it that way for a minute. Let me see what they've got." Cassidy walked slowly toward the firing line. Her boots crunched heavily on the gravel. As she approached, the recruits fell silent, though the smug smirks remained plastered on their faces. Hayes sat up, crossing his muscular arms. "Can we help you, Mum?" Hayes asked, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "Range is hot. You might want to step back before the noise startles you." Cassidy stopped right behind Hayes's mat. She looked down at his rifle, then at the target a mile downrange, a rusted steel plate barely visible through the atmospheric distortion. "You're dialing your elevation wrong for this heat, Hayes," Cassidy said softly. "The air density here is thinner than you're used to at sea level. Your bullet is going to fly faster, and experience less drag. If you take that shot, you're going to hit 6 inches high and right." Hayes scoffed, looking at Rollins, who rolled his eyes. "With all due respect, ma'am, I have a confirmed 1,200-yard shot in Syria. I think I know how to read atmospheric pressure." "A 1,200-yard shot from a static hide is one thing," Cassidy said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its frailness. "A mile-long shot in 15-mile-per-hour crosswinds with thermal updrafts is another." "If you're such an expert," Rollins chimed in, tossing a loaded magazine onto his mat, "why don't you show us? Or is that jacket going to get in the way?" The other recruits chuckled. Captain Mitchell stepped forward to end it, but Cassidy held up her hand again. She looked at Hayes, her blue eyes piercing and cold, completely devoid of the hesitation she had shown moments before. "All right," Cassidy said. She stepped up to an empty mat on the far left of the line. A standard issue Mark 22 was resting on the bipod. She didn't immediately get down. Instead, she reached up to the collar of the ruined, duct-taped M65 jacket. "It does restrict my mobility," she muttered. Cassidy unzipped the jacket and shrugged it off her shoulders, letting it fall into the dust. Underneath, she wore a simple, olive-green tank top. The sneers on the recruits' faces vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Cassidy's arms were a roadmap of violence. Jagged, pale shrapnel scars crisscrossed her left shoulder and collarbone. A massive, puckered burn scar travelled up the inside of her right forearm. But it wasn't the scars that silenced the men. It was the ink covering her right deltoid. There, etched in stark, hyper-detailed black and grey, was the bone frog, the sacred unwritten insignia of a Navy SEAL who has shed blood in combat. But this wasn't just any frog. The skeletal frog was holding a sniper rifle, and behind it was a shattered hourglass. Wrapped around the hourglass was a banner carrying the Roman numeral 6, SEAL Team 6, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGru. Beneath it were 3 small, simple stars. In the covert world of special operations, those stars represented something very specific and very deadly. 3 high-value targets eliminated in completely deniable classified operations. Hayes swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. No woman had ever officially made it through DevGru's green team. It was an impossibility. An urban legend. Whispers in the barracks spoke of a female operative attached to a Black Ops task force, a ghost who was dropped into environments where a male operator would immediately be flagged. They called her the Wraith. "Holy," Rollins whispered, his voice cracking. Cassidy didn't look at them. She dropped to the mat in one fluid, practiced motion, her body morphing from a shivering bystander into a piece of calculated, lethal machinery. She didn't touch the elevation turrets. She didn't use a weather meter. She looked through the scope, racked the bolt, loaded a .338 Norma Magnum round, and exhaled. Crack! The massive rifle recoiled against her scarred shoulder. 3 seconds later, a sharp, metallic ping echoed back across the desert, dead center of the mile-out plate. She stood up, grabbed her torn jacket from the dirt, and looked at Hayes. 6 inches high and right, Ranger. Check your math. The reason Cassidy wore the jacket, and the reason she shivered in the 112-degree heat, had nothing to do with the Nevada weather. It was a neurological reaction, a permanent parting gift from the night she earned the scars, the ink, and the haunting title of the Wraith. Every time she put the jacket on, she wasn't in Nevada anymore. She was back in the mountains of Yemen. October 2021. Al-Mahra Governorate, Yemen. Operation. Silent Scorch was supposed to be a surgical extraction. A CIA paramilitary officer, Richard Lawton, had been gathering intelligence on a splinter cell of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, when his cover was blown. He was being held in a fortified compound built into the side of a jagged limestone mountain. Cassidy, then attached to a classified DevGru element under JSOC, was deployed with a 3-man Overwatch team. Her spotter was Chief Petty Officer David Guns Ward, a mountain of a man from Texas with eyes like a hawk, and their security was Lieutenant Chris Stanton. They had hiked 12 miles through the unforgiving mountainous terrain in the dead of night, carrying 80 pounds of gear each. The M65 jacket Cassidy wore, the exact same one now covered in duct tape, had been brand new then, issued to her to blend in with local militant silhouettes from afar. By 0200 hours, they were in position on a ridge overlooking the compound, 1,400 yards away. Below them, the assaulters, a DevGru strike team, were stacking up at the compound's perimeter walls. "Wind is picking up, Cass," Ward whispered, his eye pressed to his spotting scope. "Getting gusts up to 20 knots coming off the valley floor. It's swirling." Cassidy adjusted her breathing, her eye glued to the optic of her SR-25. "I see it. The dust is shifting east, then banking hard north. It's a blender down there." "Breach in 30 seconds," the radio crackled in her earpiece. Suddenly, the night sky vanished. A massive shamal, a severe northwestern wind pushing a wall of sand and dust, rolled over the crest of the mountains earlier than meteorological reports had predicted. In seconds, visibility plummeted from a crisp, starlit night to absolute, suffocating darkness. "Blind," Cassidy muttered, wiping dust from her optic. But it was useless. The infrared lasers from the assault team below disappeared into the swirling brown soup. Then, the world exploded. A QAP sentries hadn't been asleep. They had been waiting. The compound was rigged. A massive IED detonated near the primary breach point, sending a shockwave that Cassidy felt all the way up on the ridge. Heavy machine gun fire, DSHK, 12.7 millimeters, began tearing the night apart, raining down on the pinned DevGru assaulters. "Overwatch. This is ground force. We are pinned. We have multiple KIA. Lawton is secure, but we cannot move. We need suppressing fire on the eastern tower, now." Cassidy gritted her teeth. "I have no visibility, ground force. Say you're exact. We can't get a fix. They have us zeroed." Then, disaster struck the ridge. An AQAP flanking patrol, hidden in the caves near their Overwatch position, stumbled upon them in the sandstorm. "Contact left," Stanton yelled. A K-47 fire erupted 10 yards away. Stanton took a round to the chest plate, knocking him backward. Ward drew his sidearm and returned fire, dropping 2 insurgents, but a third hurled an RGD-5 fragmentation grenade into their hide. "Grenade!" Ward roared. He dove, tackling Cassidy out of the primary blast radius. The grenade detonated. Shrapnel tore through the left sleeve of Cassidy's M65 jacket, ripping into her shoulder and collarbone. The concussive force slammed her head against the limestone. A secondary piece of superheated metal grazed her right forearm, leaving a searing burn. Ears ringing, blood pouring down her arm, Cassidy fought through the blinding pain. Ward was bleeding from his leg, dragging Stanton backward toward an emergency extraction rally point. "Cass, we gotta move! We're compromised!" Ward yelled over the roar of the wind and gunfire. "I can't!" Cassidy screamed back, spitting blood and sand. "The assault team is dead if I don't take out that DSHK. You can't even see it. You're bleeding out." Cassidy ignored him. She crawled back to the edge of the ridge, her left arm completely useless, hanging limply at her side. She dragged her heavy sniper rifle into position, using only her right arm and her knees. The wind was howling, tearing at her torn jacket. The pain in her shoulder was a brilliant, flashing white light behind her eyes. She looked through the scope. Nothing but a wall of brown sand. But she closed her eyes and visualized the compound she had stared at for 2 hours. She knew the DSK was in the eastern tower. She knew the elevation. 1,400 yards. She watched the rhythmic flashes of the heavy machine gun piercing the dust cloud like lightning in a dark storm. Calculate. With her right hand, she adjusted the windage turret. She had to account for a 20-knot crosswind in a sandstorm, shooting with one good arm, bleeding heavily. It was an impossible shot. It went against every law of ballistics. She didn't aim at the flash. She aimed 30 feet to the left and 12 feet high, firing into absolute nothingness, trusting the wind to carry the heavy bullet exactly where it needed to go. She exhaled, her heartbeat slowing to a crawl despite the chaos. Crack. For 3 agonizing seconds. Nothing happened. Then, the rhythmic flashing of the DSK in the eastern tower abruptly stopped. The deafening roar of the heavy machine gun ceased. "Target down," she gasped into her comms. "Ground force, move." She provided one-armed suppressing fire for the next 20 minutes, picking off muzzle flashes through the storm until the assault team and Lawton were extracted. Only when the radio chirped that the birds were away did Cassidy finally collapse, slipping into unconsciousness as Ward carried her off the mountain. She woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany, her arm stitched, burned, and permanently scarred. They told her she would never shoot professionally again due to the nerve damage. 6 months later, she passed the JSOC sniper requalification with a perfect score. To commemorate the night she defied the wind, she got the bone frog tattooed over the burn scars. She kept the torn, blood-stained jacket as a reminder of the edge between life and death. It was the only armor she ever needed. The metallic ping of the mile-out target was still echoing across the Nevada scrubland, but the silence on the firing line was deafening. Private First Class Bradley Hayes stared downrange, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his sun-baked face. Beside him, Corporal Derek Rollins looked like he had just seen a ghost. In a way, he had. Captain Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly in the dead quiet. He looked at the row of elite recruits, his eyes burning with a cold, fatherly fury. "You boys think you're Tier 1 material," Mitchell barked, his voice carrying over the desolate wind. "You think a Ranger tab or a recon badge gives you the right to run your mouths. The woman you just spent the last 10 minutes laughing at is Senior Chief Petty Officer Cassidy Miller. She has more confirmed, classified eliminations than this entire squad combined. She holds the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars and a Purple Heart that she earned while dragging her spotter down a mountain in Yemen with a severed brachial artery." Hayes swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the dirt. The shame radiating off him was palpable. "She didn't come here to be evaluated by you," Mitchell continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "She came here to evaluate you. And right now, you're all failing." Cassidy picked up her torn, duct-taped M65 jacket and slowly slipped her scarred arms back into the frayed sleeves. The shaking returned almost immediately, a phantom neurological response from the IED blast, but she ignored it. She walked back to the center of the line, her blue eyes locking onto Hayes. "Get up," she commanded quietly. Hayes scrambled to his feet, standing at rigid attention. "Senior Chief, I apologize. I was out of line." "I don't care about your apologies, Ranger," Cassidy interrupted, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. "Ego gets you killed. Arrogance gets your teammates killed. You think you know how to read wind? You think you know ballistics because you shot a stationary target from a fortified hide in Syria. She turned to Mitchell. Captain, bring out the fans. Set the course to condition black. Mitchell nodded to a pair of range technicians in a nearby tower. Within 60 seconds, the atmosphere on the firing line completely transformed. Massive industrial-grade aviation fans, normally used for testing parachute deployment, roared to life on the flanks of the range. They kicked up a blinding, choking cloud of Nevada sand, dropping visibility to less than 50 yards. The wind speed instantly hit 30 knots, howling and swirling unpredictably. "Gear up!" Cassidy shouted over the mechanical roar. "Full kit, plates, helmets, packs. 80 pounds! You have 2 minutes." The recruits scrambled. The cocky, relaxed atmosphere was dead and buried. For the next 3 hours, Cassidy put them through absolute hell. She wasn't teaching them how to shoot. She was teaching them how to suffer. She forced them to sprint a mile in the deep, shifting sand with their 80-pound packs, their lungs burning in the 112-degree heat. The moment they crossed the line, gasping and dropping to their knees, she stood over them with a stopwatch. "On the line!" she roared over the wind. "Target 7, 800 yards. Calculate for a 25-knot crosswind. Full value. You have 10 seconds." Rollins threw himself onto his mat, his hands shaking violently from the adrenaline and exhaustion. He peered through his scope, his chest heaving, trying to steady the reticle. He racked the bolt, guessed the windage, and squeezed the trigger. Miss. A plume of dust kicked up 10 feet to the left of the steel plate. "Dead," Cassidy said coldly, standing over him. "You rushed the math because your heart rate is at 180. In a real-world scenario, you just gave away your position to a DSHK heavy machine gun. Your squad is now pinned." She moved to Hayes. He was dripping sweat, his eyes bloodshot from the blowing sand. He took his time, fighting to slow his breathing. He dialed his turrets, calculated the spindrift, the Coriolis effect, and the aggressive crosswind. He exhaled, pausing at the natural respiratory pause. Crack, ping, a hit, barely on the edge of the plate, but a hit. Hayes let out a ragged breath, looking up at Cassidy for approval. She offered none. "You took 12 seconds, Hayes. The target moved behind cover at second 10. You shot a patch of dirt and the hostage was executed." By sunset, the recruits were physically broken and mentally shattered. They were covered in mud, sweat, and bruised egos. Out of the 12 men on the line, only Hayes and Rollins had managed to hit more than 40% of their targets under the extreme duress. Cassidy called a halt. The massive fans spooled down, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The Nevada sky turned a bruised, bloody purple as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains. "Pack it up," Cassidy ordered. "Report to the debriefing hut in 10 minutes." The debriefing hut was a stifling, corrugated metal bunker, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. The air smelled of ozone, sweat, and gun oil. Hayes and Rollins sat near the front, their bodies aching, their previous arrogance completely burned away by the crucible of the afternoon. Cassidy stood at the front of the room, her ruined jacket zipped up to her chin. Captain Mitchell stood by the door, his arms crossed. Beside Cassidy sat a thick, heavily redacted manila folder. "You boys want to know why I pushed you so hard today?" Cassidy asked, her voice raspy. She didn't wait for an answer. "Because tomorrow, most of you are getting washed out. You are not ready for Tier 1 deployment. You rely on your equipment, not your minds." Hayes swallowed, his jaw tightening. He had never failed a course in his military career. "However," Cassidy continued, picking up the manila folder, "I didn't come to Fort Fallon to teach a class. I came to recruit a spotter for an immediate Black Book deployment." The room went dead silent. 48 hours ago, A splinter faction of the Al-Shabaab terror network ambushed a UN convoy in the Jubaland region of Somalia. Mitchell chimed in, stepping forward. They took 2 American aid workers hostage. They are currently holding them in a fortified limestone quarry. SEAL Team 6 is spinning up for a hostage rescue operation at 0300 hours tomorrow. Cassidy opened the folder, pulling out a series of high-resolution satellite thermal images. The quarry is an acoustic nightmare. If the assaulters trigger an alarm, the hostages are dead before they breach the first door, Cassidy explained, tracing a finger over a jagged ridgeline on the map. The only viable Overwatch position is here, a rocky outcrop exactly 1,850 yards away, across an open desert canyon with severe thermal updrafts and unpredictable wind shears. It is a shot very few people on this planet can make, and I cannot make it alone. She looked directly at Hayes. My usual spotter, David Ward, is currently in physical therapy, recovering from a shattered femur, Cassidy said. I need someone who can read the wind, do the math under fire, and keep their mouth shut. I need someone who knows what it feels like to almost fail. Hayes sat up straighter. Senior Chief, Cassidy held up a hand, silencing him. She pulled a single piece of paper from the back of the folder and slid it across the table toward Hayes. You talk a lot about your 1,200-yard shot in Syria, Hayes, Cassidy said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. Al-Raqqa, 2022. You were providing overwatch for a Marine patrol. You spotted an ISIS commander, dialed your dope, and took his head off. You got a commendation for it. Hayes looked at the paper. It was a classified JSOC after-action report. What the commendation didn't mention, Cassidy continued, leaning in close, was that the building you were shooting from had a massive thermal signature. You didn't mask your heat exhaust. A Chechen sniper mercenary had you dead to rights in his crosshairs from a water tower 900 yards to your left. He was pulling the trigger exactly when you were. Hayes felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the report, seeing the classified thermal imaging. He saw his own heat signature in the window, and across the street, another heat signature aiming directly at him. Why didn't he shoot? Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. Because a JSOC shadow element was operating in the sector, hunting a different HVT, Cassidy said softly. The sniper on that shadow team saw the Chechen. She took the shot through a brick wall, severing the Chechen's spine a fraction of a second before he could kill you. Hayes looked up, his eyes locking onto the faded, scarred woman standing before him. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The woman he had mocked, the woman in the torn jacket, had saved his life 2 years ago, and she had never claimed the credit. She had let him keep his ego, his commendation, and his life, while she faded back into the shadows. You, Hayes stammered. That was you. You're a good shot, Hayes, Cassidy said, closing the folder. But you were cocky. You thought you were the apex predator. In our line of work, there is always someone quieter, more patient, and more lethal waiting in the dark. Today I broke your ego. I needed to see if there was a real operator underneath it. She picked up her rifle bag and slung it over her good shoulder. She looked at the ranger, her piercing blue eyes finally showing a glimmer of respect. Pack your gear, Hayes, the Wraith said, walking toward the door. Wheels up in 2 hours. We have a flight to Africa, and I expect your wind calls to be flawless. Hayes stood up, his legs shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the profound, terrifying weight of the reality he had just stepped into. He looked at Rollins, who gave him a silent, solemn nod. Hayes grabbed his pack, his helmet, and his rifle, sprinting out into the cool Nevada night to follow the ghost who had just rewritten his entire world. true lethality isn't found in loud boasts or pristine uniforms. It resides in the quiet